Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and I'm here today at the Sako factory in Riihimäki, Finland, on the 100th anniversary of the factory's founding. They were generous enough to let me come in and take a look at some of the cool historical weapons in their small arms reference collection. And specifically today, we're taking a look at a model of 1926 Suomi Submachine Gun. This is the predecessor to what would become the very cool and very good Model 31 Suomi, used by the Finnish military in the Winter War and the Continuation War. So this is the first firearm that was developed by Aimo Lahti, who would go on to be kind of Finland's primary domestic firearms designer and who was responsible for a lot of their different firearms designs. He first got interested in submachine guns in 1921. He was an armorer for the Finnish Civil Guard and was exposed to copies of the Bergmann submachine gun. There was a company called Lindelof that manufactured copies that the Finnish government ordered in like 1920, 1921. That's a subject for a separate video. But Lahti took a look at the Bergmann design and thought, it's got some problems and it's really expensive. Like, there's a ton of machining work that goes into making a Bergmann, and he figured he could do something better. So in 1921, he developed his first prototype. It was in 32 ACP. This was quickly followed in 1922 by a second prototype in 7.65 Parabellum, or 7.65 Luger. This is a bottlenecked cartridge, shorter than the 7.65 Mauser, 7.63 Mauser. It's a cartridge that was popular at that time, in particular because it was the cartridge that the Luger pistol was originally developed around. It fell out of popularity by World War II, but when Lahti was developing this, that was a good cartridge to be using. At any rate, that, by the way, is why this magazine is so curved. It's because this is a bottlenecked case that doesn't stack well in straight magazines. So, 1922, Lahti designs his first prototype in 7.65 Parabellum. 1923, he makes a few more and starts trying to get Finnish military interest in the gun, and is unsuccessful at this point. So he does take another step of patenting the design, along with a colleague, a Lieutenant Koskinen, and in 1924, they form a company called Submachine Gun Limited. Very straight and to the point. And they finally do manage to get some Finnish military interest. So the Finnish military, late in 1924, buys a handful of the guns. In February of 1925, they run formal tests on 13 of them. Things go well enough that they buy another 10 guns in October of 1925, followed by 36 more in March of the following year, March of 1926. These orders are just barely enough to keep Submachine Gun Limited afloat financially. In fact, the Finnish government would end up even buying some of the early prototypes, and just that little bit of extra money really helped keep the enterprise going. So it would be formally designated the Model 1926 kind of retroactively after the M31 was formally adopted. So before we go farther, let's take a look at what this submachine gun actually is. Looking at the M26, it's obvious that this is the precursor to the M31, but it didn't really hit me until I had a chance to take a look at this one up close, just how truly handmade these M26s were. And they were, in fact, handmade. By the way, they got the barrels from BSA in the UK, they got springs out of Switzerland, and contracted with some local machine shops to do a lot of the other fabrication work. So a few of the distinctive elements we will see here. One is the Suomi charging handle. So rather than having an open slot in the receiver, and the receiver on this side is completely enclosed, the charging handle is actually very much like an AR-15 charging handle in that it's a long rod that connects up into the bolt here and connects to this handle. So pulling this handle back is what charges the bolt. You can pull it all the way back, and then the handle's spring-loaded to return to position there. We have a selector lever on the side of the gun, which would go away. It is a 3-position selector, so it's safe here, full auto here, and it's set to semi-auto right now. And it is held in place by a very, very powerful spring detent, so I'm not even going to try to move that. But that was how the selector was done. You can see the trigger is just a plain trigger guard and trigger. In the M31, they would replace that with a sliding safety selector lever in the front of the trigger guard. We have a notch sight graduated out to 500 meters. And we can see here the original company logo, which shows you basically the muzzle of this particular gun. And this, Kunis Pistoli Osakito, which I'm not quite pronouncing right, but that is Submachine Gun Limited. And the serial number on this example is 1072. Production began with number 1001. We have a very curved magazine. This held 36 rounds of 7.65 Parabellum. And the release lever looks like you push it backwards. I believe this is actually simply relieved so that you can hold the gun more conveniently by the magazine. In order to remove it, you actually pull this lever back, and it's tight. And this is another one of those elements that you can see is just very clearly handmade. So it is a double feed magazine. This would also change on the Suomi. The M31s would use single stack magazines, or single feed magazines, sorry. A couple other elements to point out here. The stock is actually, it is both fairly long and relatively narrow here. This is one of the M31 standard production Suomis, and you can see that the stock is about an inch shorter and it's heftier, definitely a stronger design, and being shorter is going to make it more comfortable for shooting. We have a sling swivel on the bottom, coupled with a sling ring attached to the side of the barrel jacket. Now, these early prototypes were intended to actually use air compression as part of a rate-reducing mechanism, and this screw is an adjustment to change, I believe, rate of fire based on that. This ended up being a concept that was not practically successful. These, by the way, are the vent holes for the air to come out the back of the tube. And this was not carried over, this adjustability idea was not carried over into the production M31. This does have a removable barrel jacket, as does the M31. On the M31, it's a nice lever release system. On this, it's actually just a tension screw. So this handle tightens the front, basically just clamps it down. So if I open that up, you can actually see this expand. We can then rotate the barrel jacket about 45 degrees, and it comes off of a set of interrupted threads. So again, where the M31 would have a set of like 4 large lugs, on the 26, this was just a fully threaded section where they then went and machined out interrupted elements. And the barrel is removable right here. So this barrel's in there pretty tight, and yeah, I'm not going to try and pry the barrel out, but you could remove the barrel right there. You can see the little key that holds it indexed in place. On the M31, this is much simplified to a locking lever and 4 large lugs. For disassembly, the rear end cap is simply threaded on. It's a fairly long thread. Again, the M31 would change this to basically an interrupted lug system that was better. There we go. We have a small diameter recoil spring inside there. With the rear plug out, we can slide out the bolt. Now, there are several interesting things going on in here. So first off, we've got our extractor. That's simple. We have a separate weight in the back end of the bolt. And what's really interesting is that this has a floating firing pin. The M31 would, of course, have a more typical, for a submachine gun, fixed firing pin. But Lahti's original design included a firing pin safety based on this second weight in the gun. So what happens is when this goes all the way forward, when you fire it from an open bolt, inertia is going to push the firing pin forward to fire. But it is on it has this safety lever in it that it shouldn't pop up quite that far, but when I push this weight all the way in and the firing pin protrudes, this lever comes up. What this means is that if there is not a space inside the receiver for this lever to lift up into, the firing pin is held back like so. So that's fully protruded. That's cammed back just enough to prevent it from contacting a primer. So there's a recess in the top of the receiver at the very front that allows this to come up only when the bolt is fully in battery. And that's your out of battery protection, which was deemed not strictly necessary and removed as presumably an efficiency and cost-cutting measure on the M31. You can actually see the firing pin down there in the base of the bolt head. All right, there you go. There is a field stripped M26 Suomi. This one's really interesting in that you can clearly see the elements of what would become a very successful submachine gun in the M31, but at the same time, I think you can see a lot of original design intent that could be and would be improved. Things like a tensioning lever instead of a simple locking lever, the compressed air system that really didn't work so well, the more expensive and kind of more difficult to use selector lever on the side of the gun, and obviously the magazine. In total, only about 100 of the Model 1926 guns would be manufactured. About 60 of those went to the Finnish Army, some of them went to the Finnish Coast Guard, some of them went to the Finnish Border Guards. 5 of them were exported to Estonia. Lahti and his business partners certainly had an interest in manufacturing these for commercial sale outside of Finland, if possible. That didn't really happen with the Model 26, but it would happen with the later Suomi M31 design, which would end up being purchased by a variety of countries. Switzerland bought them, Denmark bought them, Sweden bought some. They kind of got around a little bit. It was finally in 1930 that Submachine Gun Limited sold basically all of its royalties and intellectual property in the Suomi patent and design to the Finnish company Tikkakoski, who would go on to manufacture the M31 for the Finnish military as well as those export contracts that I talked about. So this is happily one of those examples where the initial adopters, there were originally, I believe, 4 shareholders in Submachine Gun Limited. It was Koskinen and Lahti and 2 other partners. They managed to just scrape by for about 5 years. And then in 1930, when they sold all of their rights, they did so for a decent cash payment plus a royalty on every submachine gun that would be made after that. And they actually made out fairly well financially. So a big thank you to Sako for allowing me access to their M26. Obviously, with only 100 made, 100 or so years ago, they are quite rare guns today. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.